Today, we're going to be going behind the scenes on the gun speech that was heard around the world and why it caused multiple Democrats to leave the floor, some of them in tears. We're also going to be making the argument on why the Second Amendment is an issue of civil liberties. And of course, we'll also be talking about things that make America great. That and more is all coming up now on Making the Argument with Nick Freitas.
One thing I've learned is this: in politics and in combat, cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. And if you're willing to be the first person over those ramparts, you will be shocked at how many people will come with you. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to be a part of the generation that will restore the promise of this country and breathe new life into it.
So in March of 2018, we had a huge gun debate going on in the Virginia House of Delegates. And it was shortly after the Parkland shooting. It was also after we had had a bunch of anti-gun legislation. I was actually sitting on the subcommittee in Militia, Police, and Public Safety, which heard all of the anti-gun legislation. And that's where we killed all of those bills, because every single one of the bills that was presented was a clear violation of Second Amendment rights. It wasn't going to achieve the objectives that a lot of Democrats wanted these bills to achieve. But because of what was going on, and because of the fact that the Parkland shooting took place during session, a lot of Democrats were just adamant that we had to have more infringements on our Second Amendment if we were going to protect people. And it didn't matter what sort of arguments that we gave in subcommittee to refute some of the claims they were making. They were just passionate about it, making sure that this went through. And it went from the point of passion to being unhinged. And by that, I mean, we had people standing up saying that if we didn't vote for a particular bill, then we were on the side of terrorists. We had people saying that they're comparing us to Nazis. We even had one delegate on the House floor compare us to segregationists because we were fighting against this anti-gun legislation. And I had been listening to this for weeks. Whether it was in subcommittee, whether it was on the floor, just weeks of being called names, of having accusations hurled at us, listening to bad arguments that were nothing more than raw emotional appeals for bills that I thought were going to not only infringe on your Second Amendment rights, but not make anyone safer in the process. And finally, I'd had enough. That's really what this came down to. I had had enough. I debated about whether or not I was going to speak on the floor about it. But as soon as we were compared to segregationists, I figured that's it. This has to have a response. And so the following day I got up and I gave a 7-minute speech laying out the argument for why we believe in the Second Amendment, why we thought it was important, and also about why it was so difficult to have an honest and open debate, not just about gun policy, but about violence in society in general and how do we address violence. Because that's the one thing we should all agree on, right? There should be no real difficulty on us agreeing that, yes, when another person deliberately hurts another human being, we want to stop that. We want to prevent it from happening. We want to punish when it does happen. There's no disagreement there, but the mechanism that we use to go about achieving that is absolutely critical. And so over the course of this speech, I laid out a couple of different arguments. One of the things I talked about was how if we're serious about gun control, then we should be looking about how gun control has actually operated both in the United States and around the world. And so I brought up various statistics that were put out by left-wing groups that went through and were fascinated that whenever they looked at a particular anti-gun policy that they thought would achieve greater public safety, they were fascinated to come back later and realize that actually, no, it didn't. And in fact, in some cases, it might have even contributed to more gun violence and more violence in general. I said, if we're serious about looking at violence in society, then we can't just look at the object. We can't just look at a gun, because there's any sort of tools or mechanisms that you can use to perpetrate violence. We have to look at the behavior itself, and we also have to look at the various conditions which created an environment where we are seeing more violence, like Parkland and other instances such as that. I said, if we're serious about this, then we'll look at like what think tanks have to say about this. We'll look at places like the Brookings Institute. And for those of you who don't know, the Brookings Institute is completely a left of center think tank, right? I was not cherry picking my data and facts to comport with what my belief system was. I was pointing out that there's actually broad-based agreement that things like the breakdown of the family, Things like more and more young men growing up in homes without any sort of positive male role model. The fact that in this country we've reached a point where we expect mothers to do everything while fathers regularly abscond and don't actually do their duties as husbands, as fathers, as providers, etc. And I pointed that out. And I said, look, even the Brookings Institute acknowledges that this is a real problem. And if you go into our prison system, you will find that the overwhelmingly common characteristic among people that are in prison, especially young men that are in prison, is that they grew up in a broken home.
I think if we were going to look seriously at school shootings and gun control, we would analyze things like, why do all mass shootings seem to take place in gun-free zones? Wouldn't it be reasonable to test whether or not the efficacy of gun-free zones have actually achieved what their intended intent is? We'd start to look at most of these shooters come from broken homes. What sort of government policies have actually encouraged broken homes? You can look at left-leaning think tanks like the Brookings Institute that will actually say that some of it can be attributed to various cultural changes that happened in the 60s, to include the abortion industry. You can look at more conservative-leaning organizations that will say that the welfare state contributed significantly to dismantling the family as families became more and more dependent upon the government than they were mothers and fathers in the home raising children. We could look at various status with those areas within the United States and around the world that have strict gun control measures and what their crime rates look like, whether it's Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., and others that have incredibly strict gun laws, and yet for some reason it hasn't seemed to stop the gun violence in those particular areas.
The Democrats accused me of actually being racist for bringing this up, which to me was greatly offensive because I grew up in a broken home. I knew what I was talking about. I know what that experience is like. And as much as I'm thankful that both my mother and my father both stepped up to the plate and were parents to me, I still knew what it was like to not have mom and dad there regularly, and the sort of havoc that can wreak on a family environment, especially when you're talking about a young man growing up in a home where there's no positive male role model or influence whatsoever. And so I brought that point up. I brought the fact up that when we look at gun-free zones, that's where we start to see most of the mass shootings taking place, is in the very zones the Democrats have claimed would be safer if we made them gun-free. And as we went through all of this, I'm seeing the Democrats on the other side of the aisle get more and more frustrated, more and more angry with me. Again, the fact how dare I bring up broken homes as one of the reasons why we have higher crime rates in certain areas. I wasn't even allowed to talk about my personal experiences without Democrats accusing me of racism or bigotry. And I got to a point in the speech where I said, you know what, I'm going to call them out for comparing us to Nazis, comparing us to segregationists. And there was a moment in the speech where I relayed the history of the Democratic Party.
The other reason why it's really difficult to have an honest and open debate about this is because of this, members of this body comparing members on this side of the aisle to Nazis. Members on the other side of the aisle saying that when a 24-year-old teacher gets up and says that the whole debate is between the Second Amendment or her life, that's a false dilemma. And quite frankly, one of the ones that I found the most offensive, along with being compared to Nazis, was being compared to segregationists. I just want to remind everyone someone very quickly. It was not our party that supported slavery, that fought women's suffrage, that rounded up tens of thousands of Asian Americans and put them in concentration camps, that supported Jim Crow, that supported segregation, or supported mass resistance. That wasn't our party. That was the Democrat Party. Now, I'm thrilled that Democrats no longer believe that, and I don't believe that a single current member of this body who is a Democrat ever believe those things, but I would really appreciate it if every time you want to make a powerful point, you don't project the sins, the atrocities, and the injustices that the Democratic Party perpetrated on others onto us. So if we want to have an open and honest debate, I am all for that. Let's do that. But it does start with a certain degree of mutual respect. It starts with a certain degree of not assuming that the only reason why we believe in the Second Amendment is because the NRA paid us off. Well, if that's the sort of logic you want to use, why don't you go take a look at how much money the NRA spends and how much money Planned Parenthood spends? Because when I get up here and I talk about abortion, I don't assume that you're all bought and paid for by Planned Parenthood. I don't assume you're horrible people because I disagree with you on a policy position. I assume you have deep convictions and that we can have an argument and a debate about it. But if you're not willing to reciprocate that level of respect, well, don't be surprised when it becomes more difficult to talk about these things. Because there is a lot that we can do, and there is a lot that we need to do to ensure the security of our children and our citizens. But yes, we are going to have a problem with so-called solutions which infringe on people's liberty under the promise the government will provide for their security. Because ultimately in this last school shooting, we had a perfect example of government being engaged over 30 times and still failing to provide security for those students.
And I said, look, if you want to make an argument for why you believe something, that's fine. But don't project the sins, the past sins of the Democratic Party onto the Republican Party, because we weren't the party that did those things. And to suggest that any of us believe, that anybody, Republican or Democrat, believe in those sort of, slavery or fighting women's suffrage or any of those issues, to try to compare us to segregationists because you don't agree with us on gun policy is completely irresponsible. And just the fact that I made that claim caused like 4 Democrats to get up and leave the floor in tears. The fact that I brought up that the Brookings Institute suggested that the abortion industry has led to more broken homes caused the Democrats to absolutely lose their mind. In fact, on that one, the media did their level best to misrepresent what I was saying in that 7-minute speech. In fact, the headline that went on the Richmond Times-Dispatch after I got done was, "Delegate suggests abortion leads to mass shootings." And here's the part that you probably don't know, because you might have seen the speech, you might have seen the headline. And if you've seen both, you know it was a ridiculous headline. What you don't know is that the reporter who wrote it was actually sitting on the floor when I gave my speech. And when we went into an adjournment, because the Democrats literally requested a 15-minute adjournment to gather their composure and then come back and try to nail me, that reporter walked up and said, "Delegate Freitas, did you just suggest that abortion is the cause of mass shootings?" And I looked at him and said, "No, that's not what I was saying at all. I was saying that if you look at crime in general, we see that a lot of crime takes place when kids do not have an opportunity to grow up in homes that nourish them, where you have parents that love them, that actually hold them accountable, that take care of them, that educate them. And the Brookings Institute suggested that abortion has led to an increase in broken homes." I said, so if you've got a problem, take it up with the Brookings Institute. It was their statistic, it was their finding, not mine. But did that stop him from going, and did that stop his editor from adjusting the headline? No, they went for whatever they thought could make our side look foolish when we were making the argument for what we believe. And that's one of the regular issues that we have. And I pointed this out. I said, if you want to know why we can't have an open and honest debate, it's because every time we disagree with you, you come back and you call us Nazis. You call us segregationists. You say we're bigoted. You say we don't care about kids getting shot. Right? And then it goes even beyond that, because it's not even a debate when one side has completely made up their mind and they're not willing to be convinced with new evidence. They're not willing to be convinced with logic. They're not being willing to convince with a fairly comprehensive argument that says, look, we both want to achieve the same thing. We want there to be less violence, but let's talk about the best ways to do that will actually achieve the objective without infringing on civil liberties. No, they're not open to that. The only solution they will accept is more gun laws, more infringements on the Second Amendment. And what's so frustrating to me, and I pointed this out in my speech, is that when their policies fail to produce the results they have guaranteed us, are they going to come back? Are they going to come back to the General Assembly? Are they going to go back to Congress? And are they going to say, you know what? Maybe we got this wrong. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. Of course not. They will come back and demand even more gun control laws. So they'll start off with background checks, but they won't end there, because when it doesn't achieve what they want, they'll come back. Now we need confiscation. Now we're going to actually round guns up. Now we're going to make you a felon if you own a firearm that 1 month ago was perfectly legal to own. Because when you've convinced yourself that the government is the solution, that more government power, more government control, more restrictions on your freedom is the solution, you will not accept anything else. And that's what's so scary about this. And the reason why that gun speech, even though it was given in 2018, is every bit as relevant today as it was then, is because if you look at what happened when Democrats took control of the General Assembly in Virginia, did they come with the same bills they had before? Yeah, and they came with a bunch more. They came with confiscation bills. They came with assault weapons bans. And they were banning things that bear no resemblance to anything that could even be described as an assault weapon, even though that in and of itself is a bad term. So as you look at that speech, and I encourage you to go and watch it if you haven't watched it before, decide for yourself. Was I making a good, reasonable argument? Because it was really frustrating that for the next 3 days, Democrats got on the floor and attempted to misrepresent what I said, attempted to misrepresent my experience, attempted to use the race card as opposed to just coming up with counter arguments. And that's the sort of fight that we're in right now. And this is the part that I can't emphasize enough. It really does come down to a question of how do you believe in solving problems? Because if you believe that free people are capable of working together in voluntary cooperation to solve problems, then you are going to look at these issues very, very differently. If you believe that the government's the only way that we can do it and more government power is the only way that we can do it, well, then obviously you're going to come back with law after law after law, and people get hurt as a result. People who need a firearm to be able to protect themselves will not be able to have one. They will become more vulnerable to their attacker. And when they're hurt, will the politician pay the price for their decision, or will the citizenry? And that was the argument that I was trying to make in this gun speech. So I would encourage you to go back, take a look at it. Take a look at some of the articles, take a look at some of the things that were said about it. I mean, look, any speech that was shared by Ted Nugent can't be bad, right? So I just wanted to give you kind of a quick behind the scenes, the overview of why I gave the speech, what was going on at the time, what was the reaction, and what has happened since then. Because I think you'll find that, again, it's every bit as relevant today as it was 2 years ago. Okay, today on Making the Argument, we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment some more, but I want to hit it from a different angle. One of the things that I've noticed when we debate about this, and I don't just mean in the floor of the House of Delegates, I don't just mean in political conversation. I mean when you're just having a conversation with a friend or a family member that they're not familiar with guns, they're not too sure about this, they don't really understand what the big deal is, and their impression of pro-Second Amendment people is, we're all out on the sticks running around with camouflage on and our rifles, right? And they don't understand that this is so much more than their perception that this is all about, pro-hunting or that we, pro-gun collecting. When you look at the Second Amendment, and the reason why the founders put it in the Bill of Rights in the first place, it really is about civil liberties. And that's a term I would really encourage people to start to use when they talk about the Second Amendment. If all we talk about is the hunting component or the self-defense component or the fighting against tyranny component, and we don't talk about it as a civil liberty, I think we're missing a huge opportunity right here, because regardless of where you stand on issues, most Americans have a natural inclination to support and defend civil liberties, and for good reason. So if we've already got that, that impulse, then we need to be able to demonstrate how the Second Amendment plays right into the civil liberties argument. Because think about it, if you look at all the different rights you have, whether it's freedom of speech, right to assemble, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom, right to privacy protected under the Fourth Amendment, right to due process of law under the Fifth Amendment. If you look at all of these things, if you don't have the means to actually defend yourself, then what do those other rights really mean? I mean, we've already seen all day long, governments can write whatever they want on paper. But the reason why the Second Amendment was written, and the reason why it was written the way it is, right? It says that, the security of a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The reason why it was written in that way is because our founders understood, by looking at all of human history, that essential to people remaining free is being able to have the means to protect their own freedom. And that could be from criminals, that could be from a terrorist group, that could be from a government, right? All of those things are really important, but you have to look at it in the terms of a civil liberty. And it really is rooted into that whole idea that as a human being, as a unique individual, you have the right to be able to defend yourself. And the Second Amendment doesn't grant you that liberty. That is a liberty that pre-exists government. The reason why we put it in the Second Amendment is because we thought it was so important for the government to understand its obligation to protect that civil liberty, just like it has an obligation to protect freedom of speech or right of assembly or freedom of religion. And one of the ways that I like to illustrate this for somebody that might be a little bit skeptical, they may be looking at this and going, okay, great, it's a civil liberty, but why do you got to have an AR-15 or why do you got to have a rifle? And when you start getting into the debate and you start explaining to someone that, a lot of these anti-gun laws might sound reasonable superficially. If you don't think anything more than the stated intentions of the person pushing the anti-gun bill, then it might make sense. But the moment you start to look at how those laws are actually executed, and specifically how those laws have been executed in this country, that's where you start to realize why it is so important, and why when we say shall not infringe, what that means is shall not infringe. And one of the most relevant examples I can think of has to do with the civil rights movement in this country. If you look at the origin of a lot of anti-gun bills going back to the founding of the country and especially under the Jim Crow South, what you see is that these anti-gun bills or these gun control bills were written in such a way, and it's the same thing is true today. They were written in such a way to where they gave the locality a great deal of deference, a great deal of interpretation on how they enforced it. And as a result, there was a lot of what I would hope would be unintended consequences. But in the Jim Crow South, I think we have to come to the conclusion that there was a lot of racist intentions with a lot of those arbitrary restrictions on being able to own a firearm or being able to get a concealed carry permit. So it was set up in a time where, if you can imagine, Martin Luther King, and this actually happened, Martin Luther King filed to get a concealed carry permit. Now, in states now, like in Virginia, where it's a shall issue, provided that you don't have a felony or some sort of gun-related charge, if you file to get a concealed carry permit, you automatically get one. You still have to go through your background check, but you automatically get one. Well, the way it had been set up in the Jim Crow South was that the local sheriff or the local district attorney, they could make that decision. They could determine whether or not they thought you needed it. Well, guess what? Martin Luther King was denied his permit for a concealed carry. Think about that for a second. Here was a man that was going all over the country, that was fighting for civil liberties, that was fighting for people that were victims of institutional racism and oppression. He was getting death threats from the Ku Klux Klan on a regular basis. He was getting thrown into jail on trumped up charges. And all he wanted was the ability to be able to defend himself and his family as he continued along in his crusade to be able to expand the promise of American justice, equality before the law, to all Americans, regardless of their skin color. And his local sheriff had the ability to be able to deny him his Second Amendment rights. Now, let me ask you a question. When a Ku Klux Klan member comes in and asks for that apply under the Jim Crow South, do you think the Ku Klux Klan member got a concealed carry permit? Yeah, he did. Do you think that black families that were living in areas where they couldn't trust that their government was going to show up to protect them, do you think that they needed their Second Amendment right to be able to protect themselves, their families, and their communities against the Ku Klux Klan, and in some cases against corrupt government officials that were trying to hurt them? You don't got to wonder. We know it happened. We know it was necessary. We know how dangerous it can be when you give the government arbitrary power to be able to infringe on essential civil liberties. Because I'll tell you right now, for that black family that was scared to death, that if they marched or if they got on the bus in the segregated side where the law told them they shouldn't be, they weren't just afraid of being arrested right then. They were afraid of reprisals. But the Second Amendment allowed them to exercise their freedom of speech, their right to assembly, their right to petition their government for a redress of grievances, with safe in the knowledge that when they got back home, if someone tried to show up and harass them, torment them, oppress them, hurt them and their families, they had the means to defend themselves. And we should never be giving the government the ability to decide to pick and choose which civil liberties you're going to get and which ones you aren't. Or pick and choose whether or not they think you're ready to exercise your civil liberties, but this person over here is not, when there was no objective criteria used. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing right now in these Democrat anti-gun bills, is that they are giving the government so much authority to be able to pick and choose who gets to have a firearm in order to protect themselves and who doesn't. And whenever you start to disarm a free people, you are turning citizens into subjects. And we're not subjects in this country. And I think it's about time that those of us in the pro-Second Amendment movement understand that we have to make a good civil liberties argument. And American history gives us plenty of examples that we can use. World history gives us plenty of examples that we can use. But we have to be able to show someone that's a little bit skeptical, that's never hunted in their life, that's maybe never owned a gun in their life, that is worried about safety or the safety of their kids when they go to school. They need to understand we're worried about those things as well. But the solution of that has to do with addressing crime. It doesn't have to do with arbitrarily infringing on people's Second Amendment rights, arbitrarily infringing on their civil liberties in such a way that leaves them, their kids, their families vulnerable to an attack from somebody that comes and means them harm. So as you're looking at this argument, that's what I would encourage you to do. There's some great statistics out there as well. One of the things that the left never loves to talk about is the fact that it like 16 times more likely that a firearm will be used in this country in order for a private citizen to defend themselves from an attacker than an attacker using it to commit an act of violence or a criminal act. In fact, studies have demonstrated the low end shows about 500,000 times a year. The high end of the study shows 2 million times a year. That's 2 million times. Let's split the difference. Let's just call it a million. So 1 million times a year, a private citizen uses a firearm in order to be able to defend themselves. That is a victim that never was. That's a victim of murder. That's a victim of rape. That's a victim of domestic abuse that was never a victim because they had the means to be able to defend themselves. And we need to start talking about how those statistics actually buttress our argument that this is an essential civil liberty. And as such, the government should treat it with the respect it deserves. Okay, today on Things That Make America Great, we're gonna keep along this line of civil liberties, and I want to tell you about Frederick Douglass. For those of you that have not researched Frederick Douglass, I would really tell you that it is worth your time. He has an incredible story. We're talking about a man that grew up in slavery in Maryland. He was able, with the help of a woman that would later become his wife, he was able to escape slavery up into New York. And even though he had made it to a free state, he still had to go over to Ireland and England for 2 years in order to raise the money to buy himself out of bondage. I think a lot of Americans don't understand that, it wasn't just about getting from a slave state into a free state. Because the federal government had passed the Runaway Slave Act, that U.S. Marshals would actually go down and hunt down people and return them into bondage. And this is one of the things that Frederick Douglass was fighting against and was so passionate about. And there's a particular speech that he gave that is truly inspiring. And it's all about what the 4th of July means to the slave. And if you listen to that speech without any real context, you might get caught up on this idea that Frederick Douglass is denigrating the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Nothing could be further from the truth. The more you understand about his life and what he did and the way he did it, he was not denigrating the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Frederick Douglass was not interested in fundamentally changing the country. Frederick Douglass used the principles, and then he held up a mirror to the American people and he said, every 4th of July, you are celebrating the concepts of individual liberty. You are celebrating the concepts that all of us are created equal by God, and yet you sit here and you allow slavery and bondage and degradation to be inflicted on millions of Americans. And as I was listening to it, I felt convicted. Here it is 150 years later. I still feel convicted when I hear that speech because Frederick Douglass had a passion for individual liberty. He had a passion for the idea that each of us is beautifully and wonderfully created in the image of God and that we all have a purpose to fulfill. And as he held up that mirror to the American public, as he held up the concepts and the ideas of those principles, he taught us all that the fight for liberty, it doesn't stop with one generation. It's not good enough to simply sign the Constitution and ratify it and move on. It's not good enough to just make sure that people in your immediate sphere have certain rights and liberties. It is a quest of free people everywhere to ensure that that can be expanded to all people, all Americans, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of their economic circumstances. And if you look at the way he lived his life, he didn't just talk about it in a way that was inspiring that we could learn from. He lived his life that way. And one of the things all of us have to understand is this. When someone asks you what you believe, you cannot answer that question just by giving a verbal response. That is something you prove every single day you get up. And Frederick Douglass did that in a way that all of us can be proud of. And so as we think about not just the Second Amendment, but all of our civil liberties, I want you to remember the statement by Frederick Douglass where he said there was 3 boxes that guarantee our freedom: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. And we need to take this sort of inspiration because here was a man that if he wanted to, he could have been bitter, he could have been angry, he could have hated this country and nobody would have been able to blame him for it. But he saw what was noble and true about it, and he fought to expand it to all Americans. And that should be our focus as well. As free people, we should be constantly fighting for the best of what is in America. And Frederick Douglass provides us a perfect example of how you can do it and be effective, not just for your generation, but for generations to come. Okay, that is all the time we have for today on Making the Argument. I want to thank you for spending some time with us. I also want to encourage you, please go and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to Making the Argument. The reason why this is so important is because the more people that we have to subscribe, the more tools, the more abilities we have to be able to get this message out, to be able to get these arguments out to the people that need to hear them, whether it's convincing them on the promise and the efficacy of individual liberty, or if it's equipping someone to be able to make that argument for the first time in a way that they feel proud of and effective at doing so. So again, please subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to share this podcast with your friends so we can get the word out. Again, I'm Nick Freitas with Making the Argument, and we'll see you next time.